They paid me nearly double to work nights in a place most people avoided. The number on the offer letter was the only thing that made sense to me at the time. Rent, pills, chemo copays. There was one piece of paper I should have read before I took the key, and the mop bucket and the jacket with Highgate Psychiatric Hospital stitched over the breast. Rule 1. Never enter the basement after 10 p.m. Rule 2. Never make eye contact with patient 001. Rule 3. Do not respond to voices not spoken aloud. Rule 4. Do not write or leave messages for patient 001. Rule 5. Do not touch the observation glass. Rule 6. Report any anomaly to the night supervisor immediately. Rule 7. Do not discuss patient 001 outside staff. They were laminated. Thick, yellowed lamination, the kind you handle enough that the corners soften and you almost stop feeling the edge. Mrs. LaRose, day supervisor, a woman with cropped silver hair and a laugh that never reached her eyes, pressed that card into my palm like it was a relic, not a workplace rule sheet. "You read them," she said. "You sign here." I did that. I slid the pen back across the clipboard and pretended I'd memorized them. I had reasons not to read anything too closely. My mother, Alice, was on chemo. Her voice over the phone had thinned. Sometimes she would say numbers for medicine and the names of doctors the way someone might list ingredients. Bills were swallowing our house like tide water. Nights paid better, nights were quieter. Highgate sat on the edge of town like a brick fortress made by someone who believed in containment. It was built in 1924, they told me on orientation, corridors wide enough for stretchers and secrecy. The wards curved, the central rotunda swallowed light. The winters in Vermont made the brick look older. Inside, there were cloying smells, detergent undercut by something older, like boiled cabbage left too long on a stove. The fluorescent lights hummed with the patience of people who had been replaced by bulbs a long time ago. The night shift was supposed to be simple. Floors cleaned, trash taken out, bathrooms disinfected. Radios stuck to belts hummed with code and boredom. Most nights were the kind of work that practiced your hands to muscle memory and left your head alone to worry. I liked that at first. Mopping was honest. Mopping let me count my way through the wing and not add the numbers my mother asked for into every silence. Gay Duchesne was the night supervisor. He wore the hospital like an old coat and would not let anyone wrinkle the seams. He had the kind of face that had learned people were unreliable, and, in his experience, people who worked nights were more unreliable still. When I met him, he leaned on the frame of the supply closet and told me, without a preface, that Highgate kept things we didn't show on tours. "It's not what you think," he said. "Read your rules, keep to them. If you can't, don't be here." I smiled and nodded because that's what people do when authority sounds practical. I shoved the laminated card into my back pocket. I told myself I'd read them later, the way you tell yourself you'll get to an overdue bill, that there would be a tomorrow where the urgency was less sharp. The rules sat in my pocket like a weight. They made a small clack when I bent over the mop bucket, like a heart. The first weeks were ordinary, in the way a canyon is ordinary until you peer over the edge. There were patients who said the same things every night. The elderly woman who recited the names of cities that no longer existed. The man who folded paper cranes from the pages of an old magazine. There were smells, bleach sharp on the linen carts, coffee too old at the nurse's station, the faint copper of something else you couldn't name until you turned your head and it was gone. A night of work stretched and folded into itself. You learned which doors didn't lock, which vending machines jammed when you were late, which nurses would swap you a sandwich if you looked like you had eaten only vending machine pretzels for dinner. I learned where the lights flickered, so you could step into the dark and not wake anyone. I learned when the night radio filled with static and when someone at the nurse's desk hummed, low and private, as if trying to draw a line between what we were responsible for and what we weren't. I also learned the hospital kept hours for other things. The basement was not only where old furniture went to die, It had vaults and observation rooms, and a stairwell that went down past the hum of everything familiar and into a different kind of silence. I had been told, I'd nodded and smiled when they said it, that the basement was off-limits after 10. I had the card, folded and softened in my pocket. I had the key card in the little plastic sleeve hanging off my belt. It happened 2 weeks in, on a night when the bleach ran dry. Bleach is a janitor's lifeline. When you run out, everything gets thinner, more human. I was 3 wings into a midnight shift, cart pushing ahead, the mop squeaking, when I noticed the bottle, empty. I checked the supply closet. The inventory sheet was handwritten and clumsy. The dispenser in the corridor was low. My stomach tied into a familiar knot, the kind that had my mother's face at the center of it. I could see the ledger stacking up in the mornings, more bills, another reminder. I thought of texting Mrs. LaRose. She was half a state away by then, managing daytime chaos. There was a rumor among the night crew that maintenance kept a reserve in the basement. You have to understand how rumors act in a place that lives by repetition. Rumors are a kind of map. I told myself I would only be down there for 5 minutes. I told myself the rules were just that. Rules. Rule 1. Never enter the basement. After 10 p.m. I remembered as I swiped my card and pushed through the heavy door. The key card beeped. The light above the stairwell threw a cone of yellow that smelled faintly of old paper. I walked down, each step consuming sound. The basement was cool, in the way stone can be cool, anchoring, indifferent. Shelves loomed with things that seemed to have been put away and forgotten. I found the spare bleach tucked behind a crate, labeled with a date I couldn't read. The bottle was heavy and felt like rescue in my hand. On my way back I passed a vault door, the kind of reinforced inspection windowed thing that should have been locked. I pressed my palm to the cold glass almost by accident. There was a person on the other side. At first I thought she was old. There are old people in psychiatric hospitals. The seasons of their lives are worn in their palms and the slow cadence of their speech. But she was older in a way that did not match the calendar. Her skin had the papery translucence of leaves. Her hair looked sifted with frost. She sat near the observation window with her hands folded and wore a robe that had once been hospital green and at some point had given up on color. Her face was mostly calm. It was the eyes that were wrong. They were like empty rooms with a light on inside, pale, too bright, focused in a way that made my teeth ache with remembered childhood superstitions. For a moment, I thought she could not see me. Then she turned her head. She looked right at me. "You shouldn't be here," she said, and the words were not a mouth's labor. They arrived in my head like someone had tuned a radio to my skull and set the volume. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream. It sat on my tongue and made the air taste like pennies. I jerked my head back from the glass, and instinct made my mouth open, but nothing came out. The vault room smelled faintly of lemon and something floral, the same smell they'd keep in here for cleanliness, sterilized away to nothing. The condensation on the inside of the glass had drifted in a finger smear where her breath must have fogged the surface. In that fog, letters appeared as if written by a careful fingertip. "Read your rules." My lungs forgot how to fill, and then remembered with a painful show of coughing. I stepped back, the bleach bottle clanking against my shin like an accusation. I don't know what I expected. A trick of light. The imagination gorged on loneliness. Maybe someone on voice therapy. I had not expected her name. "Tyler," she said. This time it wasn't the glass. It was nothing I could point to. It was there, direct and intimate. The sound of it interfacing with everything I had ever been called. It sat on my ribs like a hand. I ran. The stairwell swallowed me. And for the first time since I'd started, I left the bottle right where I'd found it. I clambered back onto the ward with my badge blinking in protest. My palms were sticky. My radio hissed a static laugh that meant nothing. I walked past the nurse's station with my head bent, and for a moment I considered handing in my keys and saying the hospital had made me ill. Instead, I went to the supply closet and shoved the laminated card into the trash can like it was a match, and I didn't want to watch it burn. I don't know why I stayed. Part of it was the money, always the money. Part of it was the way the hospital seemed to close around its own secrets. Turning away felt like jumping into a current with no bank to hold on to. Mostly, though, it was an unsettled guilt. That woman's voice, Sarah Whitmore, as I would learn later, had been a sharp violation, but it had also been a plea. My phone buzzed at 3:17 a.m. I checked it with the practiced detachedness of someone trained to let alarms interrupt sleep. Unknown number. Welcome back, it said. I sat with the chair under the fluorescent light and watched the message blink. My thumb hovered over the screen like an animal deciding whether to eat bait. The next day I called in sick. I told Mrs. LaRose that the nausea had been bad, that the smell of the hospital had turned against me. She was practical and blunt. "Days are worse than nights for you, Tyler," she asked. She also, to my slight embarrassment, asked about the rules. "You read them before you signed," she said. "Nothing there you couldn't handle." I didn't tell her about the voice in my head. I didn't tell her about the breath writing. I fumbled excuses as if they could keep me away. I didn't really sleep. I drove to my mother's house and sat in the kitchen while she slept in the back room, a thin blanket over her like a paled banner. The TV murmured daytime soaps, and I counted the bills on the table to see how long the money would stretch if I quit. It wouldn't. It never would. Mr. Leopold had worked nights for 20 years. He had the kind of face that had been made by the night, taut, stitched with thrift. He'd left in a hurry 2 winters ago, and the rumor was that he couldn't stand what he'd seen. People don't like to talk about him. Once, in a break room that smelled like coffee and regret, Duchesne had used his name like punctuation. "Leopold saw things," he said, but he said it like a man cataloguing a storm. They sent him away for a year, and then he didn't come back. You learn fast not to ask too many questions about the past employees in psychiatric hospitals. They are like weather. People can say it was stormy, but if you want the map, they frown. I went back because the rent was due, and because my mother had asked me, in that small voice people use when they want to be needed, if I could still pick up nights. I told myself I'd be careful. The rules would remain in my pocket this time, flat and readable. K. Duchesne met me by the supply closet. He didn't smile. "You look like you swallowed a storm," he said. He folded himself on the table and waited. "Ran out of bleach," I said. It sounded like a confession. The bleach and nothing else kept the truth small. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he put his palm flat on the laminated card like he could press the letters back into my skin. "You didn't read them," he said. "No," I said. "I did. I signed, but I didn't." Duchesne's voice was a blunt thing. Everything that follows those rules is not just to keep you safe, it's to keep the people behind the glass safe. There are risks. People lose coherence. People feel invaded. We contain that because we have to, but we don't leave it to chance. He led me down to the administrative office where Dr. Tyler Peller was waiting. Dr. Peller had the kind of smile that tried to be easy, but couldn't quite mask that he measured discomfort the way I measured wages. He moved through the world like a person who'd learned to speak carefully about dangerous things. "In our terminology," Dr. Peller said, without letting his voice harden into a lecture, "Sarah Whitmore is listed as patient 001 because she was the first in a cohort of cases we tracked. There's a history here that looks like a set of interventions and consequences. The treatments, what was done, changed the way her sensitivity to cognitive stimuli manifest. We hypothesize, and I want to be explicit, this is a hypothesis that she perceives cognitive feedback differently. It is not a clinical prescription to the world outside this campus." He used the word hypothesis like a hand rubbed over a bruise. "Some of us use metaphors, threads, tuning forks, to talk about this because it's easier than pretending we've got the right words. What we do know is that certain forms of sensory contact, direct eye contact, certain exposures, seem to facilitate a bridging phenomenon. A bridge can be fragile. It can also be directed under supervision. He explained things in sentences that avoided certainty but traded in plausible-sounding models. In that office I felt both chastened and a little relieved, a human desire to name the thing that had named me. He showed me records, careful and black-typed, of the patient's intake notes, of the containment history. He told me, in a way that made the word "we" heavy, about the laminated rules that had been designed around incidents and failures. "You should know what being a bridge looks like," Duchesne said. "We don't recruit. Bridges happen. Somebody meets the conditions and they're connected. We train, we supervise, we stop. We don't let people wander in with no plan." "I didn't plan," I said. "I didn't want to—" Duchesne didn't let me finish. "You came into contact after hours," he said. "You made eye contact despite the rule and someone wrote on the glass." "It's condensation," I said. "Someone fogged the glass. Maybe the ventilation made patterns." Dr. Paler's smile thinned. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not. But there is an anonymous communication associated with you that we've observed arriving to the personal devices of night staff. We have logs and—" I felt the floor tilt. "Logs?" "It was an odd number pattern," he said. "Not threatening, intrusive. It matched a time-stamped entry to the internal observation system. We don't know the source of the message yet, but targeted texts are how bridges can reach out." He asked me things. Had I felt pressure? Had I heard voices? Had I dreamed of things I did not experience? I lied. Not all the time. I held back the worst of it. I told them about the name on the glass and the breath writing, and I watched as Duchesne's face did a little thing where he tried to keep his compassion from snapping into authority. "You found yourself in the middle of something we have protocols for," he said. "We keep those rules to prevent harm. We keep them because people inside can have their boundaries violated by unchecked contact." He offered options. I could hand in my keys. I could walk away and let the connection be. I could be reassigned, or I could agree to remain on nights, to be monitored, and to participate in supervised sessions where the bridge, if I was indeed the bridge, could be trained to be an anchor rather than a conduit. "Anchor," Dr. Peller said, "not spoken lightly. Anchor work is about teaching you techniques to keep your own mind firm, stopping cues, consent protocol, allowed contact times. We don't ask for anything that isn't monitored and revocable." The words came with forms and consent blanks, and enough procedural language to make a lawyer nod. There was nervousness in Duchesne and clinical caution in Dr. Peller, and beneath it all a tiredness I recognized. The tiredness of people who had watched systems that were meant to protect make monsters out of their inability to be gentle. I should have quit. I packed the forms and left them on the desk for a night, and drove to my mother's house and slept badly on the pull-out couch while the TV hummed. My fingers had the habit of turning the laminated rules over and over without looking at them, the way someone might pet a stone for luck. I balanced the money I had against the risk, like adding both ends of a scale and pretending gravity wasn't involved. That night, a text came again at 2:04 a.m., unknown number. "We have ways of noticing," it read. "Be careful who you watch. It could have been a prank. It could have been someone in the night crew with a sense of mischief." But the message felt like the hospital itself waking and tapping me on the shoulder. I swallowed the impulse to delete it and left it on the table like a coin on a counter. When I returned to Highgate, Duchesne met me at the side entrance and did not ask why I showed up. He had an expression like a man who had already lost someone and was trying not to add more names to the ledger. "Consent is not a rubber stamp," he said. "If you can't do it, say so. If you can, you will not be alone in the room." They put me through orientation with more careful words than the first time. They explained fatigue protocols, stopping cues, visual anchors. There were forms where I had to initial lines about monitoring and about understanding that any identification of the bridge was an emergent property, something we watched, not something we presumed to control. We talked about Mrs. Bergeron, an old woman whose life at Highgate had been a slow series of small kindnesses and a single documentary of loss. She was a cautionary tale, a patient who'd been subjected to experimental things in another era, and who now couldn't decide where her memory stopped and the hospital's routine began. They did not present her as monstrous. They presented her as a human whose autonomy had been desirable as a project rather than respected as a person. The contrast was deliberate. "You will be trained to be an anchor," Dr. Paler said, "to hold your own line when someone reads you, to be a safe conduit for them to practice, to consent, to stop." "Why me?" I asked. The question had all the worn edges of someone asking why a storm had chosen their roof. "You were exposed under the conditions that made the interface possible," Duchesne said. "You made eye contact. You were in the basement. You are a bridge now in potential. Some people are more receptive than others. Some have a resilience that can be trained into steadiness. It felt like being examined under a microscope without the slide. I signed the pages because my mother needed me to, but also because the thought of walking away felt like abandoning something I could not define. They fitted me into a schedule. It would be supervised at first, a neutral room with no stimuli, grey walls, a table, a chair, and a camera that felt like a patient. There would be someone in the next room with a stop card. There would be a medically trained presence. There would be rules. All the while, the laminated card was a dull weight in my pocket. I had not read every line on it, not really. I had known enough to end up where I was, in a system that asked you to uphold a list of bizarre prohibitions and offered you the safety of monitoring and the promise of mutual dignity instead of secrecy. At night, in the staff lounge, I watched the corridor as if it might rearrange itself. I learned where the windows masked the moon and where a plant had collected dust in a pot that used to live in a common room. I learned the rhythm of the radio calls, 2 short bursts for a medication run, 3 for a transfer, small rituals that held a place together. Sarah's name floated at the edge of every conversation. People who mentioned her did so with a kind of reverence that did not mean they were afraid of her so much as they were aware of the responsibility she represented. She was patient 001. She was not a case number. They told me as much. In conversations, she was described as an individual who had been given a life by the hospital's failure to imagine better containment, and also by the small human kindnesses they had occasionally extended. On a grey Thursday, returning from a late tray pickup, I passed the observation window again. It was broad daylight through the rotunda, and the vault glass was clear and ordinary. Someone had cleaned it, and the smear of breath writing was gone. For a moment, for an ordinary human breath, the world felt less like a thing that could move without me. I went home and watched my mother sleep, and in the morning I took the money from my pocket and paid the smallest bill. I felt both heroic and ridiculous, like a man who'd put a coat on to brave an ocean. When the first supervised session was scheduled, everything tightened into procedure. A nurse who would be present, her name was Marta, went through stopping cues with me like a teacher rehearsing a safety drill. "If at any moment you feel overwhelmed, you say stop," she told me. "We press the notification. We end the session. There is no shame." She told me about consent, about the importance of mutual agreement before contact. This was not a show. They meant it. I told myself I was prepared. I told myself the rules would keep me safe. That night, before the session, I lay awake and read the laminated card until the letters blurred. Rule 4. Do not write or leave messages for patient 001. Rule 5. Do not touch the observation glass. Rule 7. Do not discuss patient 001 outside staff. I folded the card and slipped it back into my pocket. If there was a thing to be done, it was to follow the script. If there was a danger, it was to feel alone. The alarm drone of the night was the kind of background I had grown to breathe. The corridor lights hummed like a chorus. The neutral room smelled like lemon and cleaned plastic. The chair in the center was ordinary. I sat and tried to make my hands stop jittering. They brought her in on a trolley. They wheeled her through the door and set her in the chair opposite me with a care that looked almost ceremonial. She was small and folded, and the robe looked like it had been patched and retouched a dozen times. Her eyes, those eyes, found me like a magnet, and there was a pressure in the room that felt like static before a storm. "Her name is Sarah," Dr. Peller said softly. "You will have a stop card. You will have a person monitoring for your vitals. You will use the queue when needed. Remember consent." She nodded at me with no theatrics, little domestic gestures like someone who is glad you finally arrived to tea. "Tyler," she said, and it was not only a name. It landed in me and made me feel naked in a way words should not. She reached for an image, and suddenly the room around us changed. It wasn't visual so much as texture, a pattern of threads, like beams of spectral yarn stretching out and brushing fingers. I felt something like pressure in my temples, an internal vibration, as if someone tuned a fork and put it against my sternum. The session began to blue out the edges of the room. The monitor beside me wrote my heartbeats into a line that climbed and sank like a sea. Marta's hand was warm on the stop card. Her knuckles whitened when she squeezed. Dr. Peller sat in the next room, looking at a bank of screens. Duchesne stood by the door like an old lighthouse, stationed and watchful. Sarah began with small things. She showed me the kitchen table in my mother's house. There was a coffee ring on the newspaper, and then she moved to places she'd never been but could know. A pine forest at dusk she remembered from a song, a hospital corridor lined with doors like the one we sat in. The threads around her looked like spider silk and moonlight. They brushed across me and took with them things I didn't see as mine until they were pulled out. A childhood smell, the name of a dog I had when I was 5. It was not theft. It felt like opening a window that had been sealed and letting air in and out. There were rules and we followed them. We used a stopping cue once. I said the word, a clumsy sound, and Marta pressed the button. The session halted. The monitors readjusted. We breathed. Dr. Peller came in and asked about my comfort level and made notes. And then, for a wild, impossible second, Sarah's attention flicked beyond me, and I felt a city like a bruise. Fear and heat, and people moving as one. The monitors spiked. Marta's hand was an instruction and a hymn. The smell of smoke came like a rumor. It was thin at first, the kind a person might confuse for burned toast. Then the PA system cracked with a clipped voice. Fire alarm codes in Highgate are precise. They are designed to move people quickly and prevent panic. The lights flickered. Somewhere down the east wing, a door latched. The building took a breath and prepared to run. Sarah looked at me, and for the first time that night, I felt something that went beyond contact. It was the sheer volume of many minds strung together. She wasn't just seeing. She was in glimpses of other people, old men who didn't understand what was happening, a nurse who had lost a shoe on the stairs, a patient in the East Wing who was trying to tell someone that he couldn't walk anymore. "Help them," she said in my head. It arrived like an order, but not cruelly. It was the steady insistence of someone pointing at a child who is about to run into traffic. The room smelled stronger now. Smoke threaded the neutral-smelling lemon and plastic. The monitors wrote jagged little spikes on the screen. Marta was at the door before my feet found the floor. We all moved because procedure said move, and because in that moment the laminated rules had become something else. Less about barriers than about the careful math of safety. Sarah had painted the map of fear for me with raw, jagged notice, and I had the training, new and fragile enough to translate it into a simple action. Call the code, identify the rooms where people were disoriented, do not open doors that could feed a draft of flame. Duchesne shouted the code into the radio. Nurses ran. The PA system repeated and filled with voices and orders. Elsie from the East Wing, who usually recited city names a dozen times a night, had stopped and was clinging to the bed rail. Emma Reyes, a patient in the recovery wing, was calling out for her mother and could not find her shoes. We moved like people who remembered drills but had never been in a real storm. The fire would become a test. The way we kept people moving would be the thing we could point to when the smoke cleared. Sarah's presence, tuned as it was, threaded through the panic and found the lost things, lost attention, lost balance, lost memory, and put them back together. It was like threading needles through a seam and making something less jagged. When the East Wing doors finally opened and people stepped out into the cold night air, the hospital made a sound that was part relief and part an animal's exhale. Someone counted heads. Someone folded blankets. Someone held a patient's hand and said, "You're okay, we're here." The fire alarm kept ringing in a way that meant the city outside had learned to ignore our wail. The tactical things we had rehearsed were working. The staff moved with a choreography born of repetition and fear, and the need to keep the people behind our charge safe. Sarah sat back in her chair and pressed her hands together as if in prayer, and for the first time since the glass, I saw her like a person who had given something away and been paid in aching. She had taken on a scale of other people's terror that would not be easy to carry. Her face had the kind of exhaustion that belongs less to bodies and more to attention. When the fire department arrived and we were herded like a half-remembered parade, Dr. Peeler stayed beside me and put a hand on my shoulder with a firmness that told me he was both grateful and unsettled. "We need to understand what happened," he said. "We need to understand how she could be so precise in accessing those minds. We'll be looking at protocols." Duchesne didn't smile. He rubbed his thumb along the rim of his coffee, a nervous little ritual. "You did what we train you to do," he said. "You kept your mind as an anchor. You didn't let yourself get swept into her currents. Not many could have." I kept thinking of the laminated card in my pocket. Rule 6, report any anomaly to the night supervisor immediately. The anomaly had become a rescue. The list of prohibitions had become, for a few minutes, the scaffold that allowed people to move through terror and out into life. That night the hospital smelled of smoke and 1,000 cigarettes that weren't there. It also smelled like the lemon cleaner and the boiled cabbage and the small dinners people kept in the nurses' station. My hands shook, and I couldn't tell if it was from the adrenaline or the realization that what I'd feared had given something back. At shift change, Dr. Peeler asked me to stay and answer questions. He used the word study with a soft touch, as if it was something that might summon hope or call down scrutiny. He mentioned Emma Reyes, the patient who had been calmest during the evacuation, and how her quick exit seemed to undo something that had been building in her for weeks. He mentioned the board. He mentioned possible transfer and documented improvement. He did not promise anything. He said possible, and we'll see. Outside, dawn was grey as old ash. I drove home with the laminated card heavy in my pocket and the taste of someone else's fear in my mouth. I sat at my mother's kitchen table and watched the sunlight in the window, for the first time feel like less of an accusation and more like a map. My phone buzzed once, no message this time. For a moment I allowed myself the private thought that perhaps something could be repaired without being owned. But in the back of my mind, a question kept returning like an echo between walls. When I had looked through the glass, had I broken a rule because I was careless? Or had the rule been waiting to be broken because something in the world needed it to be? The laminated card was heavier than before. The rules were less a barrier now, and more a manual for keeping something that was dangerous also useful. I did not know if that made me braver or more culpable. I slept a little and dreamed of threads. In the morning, when the phone rang and my mother's voice said quietly, "They might change the protocol," I thought of Sarah at the window and the way the light had fallen over her face like some small, ungiven mercy. When I walked back into Highgate that night, the card in my pocket felt like both promise and threat. I had agreed, half in fear, half in calculation, to be trained as an anchor. I had not yet learned the rhythms of how to hold a mind without losing myself. I had not yet understood the cost. But walking the corridor, past the humming fluorescents, past the potted plant collecting dust, I kept my hand on the card until the edges softened into the shape of my fingers. The rules were there. They always had been. I only had to decide if I would let them guide me forward or push them back into the pocket and pretend I had never read a line. If you're still with me and want the full strange rules list and how I survived them, hang on. I promised to tell it straight. The weeks after the fire were a blur of paperwork and quiet. There were interviews to give, forms to initial, and half a dozen meetings where Dr. Paler would circle phrases like observed phenomenon and controlled exposure, with the same worried patience he used in the neutral room. The board wanted language that wouldn't scare donors. The lawyers wanted airtight clauses. Duchesne wanted people who would actually show up for night shifts. I wanted the rent paid and my mother to have another round of medicine. Training slid into night like the cold that comes after the day has said its piece. We met 3 nights a week in the neutral room at first, and then in a larger observation suite as the sessions expanded. Marta ran the stop cue drills until saying stop felt less like a command and more like an old habit. She taught me to name things without letting them make me small, the way a memory settled on the inside of my skull, the mood that arrived with someone else's fear, the sound a particular imagine would make when it wanted attention. We used anchors, small physical things I could look at or hold when the threads tugged. A coin, a strip of yellow laminated plastic with the rules printed on it that I kept folded in my wallet, a photograph of my mother's hands as she held the remote. We also practiced being boring. The staff joked about it at first, boring as a kind of heroic endurance. We sat in silence while Sarah moved through other people. She would wince like someone pulling thorns from a paw, and the room would feel suddenly too bright. My heart would push hard enough to make the monitor spike. Marta's hand would be ready on the stop card, Duchesne or Doctor. Pella would remind me to breathe and to name the 4 things I could see: the clock, the seam in the chair, the calendar, the light switch. Naming was a way of keeping the mind home. Sarah was not the frightening caricature I had somehow imagined in my head after that first night. She was patient and sly and, in small moments, hilariously domestic. She liked to tell stories about the sound of rain hitting a porch roof, even though she had not lived in a house like that in most of her memory. She knew songs that made her hum. She could whistle in a way that made the rest of us listen. Sometimes she drew. The sketches became our shared language, loops and threads and little knots that looked like the diagrams you see in children's coloring books, except the lines were always very precise, like someone had learned to map invisible wind. The first time she reached across something and pulled a small, private memory into our view, it felt like a violation and a gift at the same time. She coaxed rather than stole. She liked confirmation, an exchanged nod, a finger tapped 3 times if consent was given to continue. The rules had built in a choreography for respect. She would ask in her head, we would offer a signal, she would begin. There was a bureaucracy to consent that felt ridiculous and right. In practice, it was like asking someone if you could look at their baby album and letting them show the page they wanted you to see instead of rifling through the whole book. Rule 2, Duchesne reminded me more than once, tapping the laminated card when he thought I looked tired. Never make eye contact with patient 01. The eye contact thing, it's a shortcut. It pulls faster than other cues. It gives her a lever. It wasn't just about the eyes. It was about the way the body offered itself as a tune. If you met her gaze and held it, the thread could wrap around you like a vine. The training was about giving her room and about making sure I had a handle on the vine before she wrapped it around me. Mrs. Bergeron, who'd been at Highgate longer than anyone could remember, was a particular kind of cautionary teacher. She sat near the sunroom in a way that made you think of someone waiting for light. She'd been in and out of experimental programs in eras when the hospital was more interested in blunt instruments than in consent. Her memory was patchwork, and she sometimes spoke like a woman who had been stitched back together by good intentions gone wrong. She was also, to my surprise, a soft conduit. I brought her a cup of tea one night after a session. She looked at me with eyes that always seemed to be remembering a joke. Without a preface, she said, "You hold yourself like a house on a cliff, Tyler. Don't let them build a road straight through the attic." It was the kind of sentence that sounded ridiculous until you felt its meaning. There was a lot of talk about containment and procedure on one side, and on the other an awareness that being useful did not mean becoming used. Mrs. Bergeron talked about names and boundaries and the shame of being turned into an exhibit. There was tenderness in her voice that did what kindness is meant to do. It nudged you toward accountability rather than away from it. We had scares. The anonymous texts did not stop. Sometimes they arrived at 3:17 a.m., sometimes later, always unsigned. They were simple, like a watch tapping. "We notice," or "Be careful who you watch," or sometimes more cryptic lines that suggested someone knew which staff had been in which room. Dr. Peller said the texts were probably a prank or a leak from someone who wanted control. Duchesne said they were a risk. I said nothing because words in the moment felt like tinder. The texts could be used to panic people, to make someone break the rules by accident. Once, in a moment of hysteria, an inexperienced temp nurse tried to move a patient from a locked room because he was convinced, after a text, that the patient was about to harm himself. He left the observation glass open and touched the frame, a breach of Rule 5. Do not touch the observation glass. It was a small, human mistake, the kind someone makes when fear presses down hard. The patient was disoriented by the sudden contact, and for a minute it looked like the protocol might tear. We contained it. Marta and Duchesne moved like the practiced machinery they'd trained to be. I used the stop cue when Sarah started to widen to other people who weren't consenting. The temp nurse had to step back and breathe and be reminded how to hold the space. Later, when the temp was calmer, she apologized and was stunned that the rules were both a prison and a rescue. That incident made headlines in the internal memos. Dr. Peller wrote an article that was careful and clinical in a journal the hospital circulated among its backers. He used the word qualitative a lot and reminded readers that this was hypothesis, not doctrine. The board liked the part about ethical frameworks for telepathic sensitivity, and the grants people liked the idea of funding better containment that also respected dignity. The language was deliberate because people in suits liked to feel like they were choosing. We, the night staff, felt the results in small ways. More training hours, a therapist assigned once a week for staff who'd been present during bridging events, and an offer for me to be included in a pilot program that would study methods of anchor training. Emma Reyes was a patient who became, in the end, the cleanest argument for what we were trying to do. She had been chronically anxious, unable to sleep, and she'd been in Highgate's recovery wing for months. She'd always been polite to me, that old habit people develop when you clean the floor and put down a new mop bucket. During the fire, she had been the kind of patient who would have frozen in place without help. Instead, guided by Sarah's awareness, she moved with a purpose that rescued her, and then seemed to open something in her that had been stitched shut. Over months, Emma's tremors softened. She made better choices at mealtimes. She resumed the small craft projects she used to do before anxiety stole the afternoons from her. Her progress was not miraculous. It was a slow, visible unbundling of pain and confusion. Her visits to the common room became more frequent. One day, she was able to tell a joke in front of the staff and make us laugh. Small things, but they mattered. "Doctor," Bella used Emma's progress as part of his measured case for a transfer of Sarah to a room with more daylight. He was careful in how he framed it, as if hope needed hedges to survive scrutiny. I helped with the conversion. They let me paint the windowsill. It was an odd honor to sand and smear primer where a patient would touch and look. The paint had the cheap, faint smell of a new start. We cut out the heavy curtains and replaced opaque glass with something that let real sky through. We added a chair that had been donated, and someone, Mrs. LaRose it turned out, brought a small potted plant. Sarah's room, before the window, had been quiet and long, and full of the little rituals the staff gave to it. Clean sheets at morning, a hand mitten in winter, a blanket folded just so. The window changed the choreography of that small life. The first time she sat in it and the light reclaimed the lines of her face, she made a small sound like someone who had found a sock she thought lost forever. Her hands reached toward the glass and rested there, then retreated when the rules reminded us she'd asked for no physical touching. When the board finally agreed to the transfer, they did so with slides and cautious optimism. Possible transfer became approved trial transfer with strict monitoring. The language was careful, and the lawyers were satisfied. Yet among the staff there was a quiet, unspoken relief. The room with a window was less of a triumph for policy and more a gentle, human correction. We had isolated someone for 70 years. We had given them little of the world. Maybe we could give back a piece. Not everyone agreed. There were complaints from some families who had members at other facilities. They worried about safety. There were ethics reviews that felt like smoke and mirrors. There were whispers about liability. I sat in one board meeting at Duchesne's invitation and listened to two men argue the fiscal cost of a window like they were discussing roofing shingles. When I raised my hand, because Duchesne gave me the pass and because I'd come this far, I said what I'd seen at the evacuation and how Sarah had made it possible for certain people to move when panic would have frozen them. I didn't talk about the voice in my head from 2 weeks into the job. I talked about Emma and about the difference between containment that hides and containment that heals. They approved the transfer. The day Sarah moved into the new room, the staff corridor felt like a small parade. We wheeled the bed with hands that were more gentle than mechanical, as if we were carrying bread to a neighbor. She looked out the window and saw sky. For someone who had spent most of decades in concrete light, the blue made an audible change to her. She smiled like a person who had received a letter she didn't expect. It was after that, after the board minutes and the stamped forms and the painting, that Mr. Leopold came by. He had been gone for a long time, and people had given his leaving many names. Some said he had broken too many rules. Others said he had had a breakdown. He appeared at the supply room door like someone who had crossed a long country and decided the town was worth coming back to look at. He did not have the jaggedness I had imagined. He was thinner, yes, and his hands shook when he picked up a mop, but his voice was warm and blunt. He sat with me and watched Sarah 10 minutes at the window like a man who was learning how to pray. "You did what you could," he said finally, not sparing me from the gore's truth. Night work takes a kind of loyalty you don't get credit for. But don't let useful turn into used. I'd wanted to ask him why he left in the first place, what had broken him to the point he couldn't come back. Instead, I listened to him talk about small things, his sister's funeral, the way the snow stuck to telephone wires, how he learned to count the paces between certain lights to keep his head from spinning. He admitted, in a low voice, that he'd been part of an exposure years ago that hadn't gone according to the rules. "Some things," he said, "you can't just rehearse your way out of. You've got to be stubborn, but be stubborn about the right thing." There was a night, months later, when the anonymous texts culminated in a small sabotage. Someone, I never learned who, had taken down a buzzer from a door and shoved it behind a radiator. It wasn't meant to be dramatic, it was petty, but petty is a ladder to dangerous things. A young nurse, fresh from school and tired of the weight of being responsible for fragile things, followed a thread of rumor and opened a door she should have left locked to check if the bridge was contacting other staff directly. It went wrong. She touched the glass. She answered Sarah by name without a monitoring plan. For a moment, the room was a flurry. The nurse's face went blank and then too raw and then pale. I saw the thread lash at her like a current. Marta hit the stop cue and dragged the nurse from the room, and the young woman vomited in the corridor like someone who'd swallowed her fear. We filed reports. We watched the nurse as she recovered. She apologized. She was shaken. She left Highgate to go to another facility on an administrative leave of absence. None of it was dramatic in the way movies make moral choices look. It was messy, humane, and ugly in that small way that real life is. The rules had been written to prevent exactly that kind of scramble, but humans make mistakes. Those mistakes taught me about responsibility. The rules were not just fences, they were promises. They promised that when contact happened, it would be careful, temporary, and revocable. They promised that the bridge would not become infrastructure. They promised that human dignity came before curiosity and before the flattering thrill of solving something no one else could. The rule list, never enter the basement after 10 p.m., and the rest, was designed to be clumsy because sometimes bureaucracy is the blunt instrument that keeps people alive. My mother improved. The words improved and remission were careful and slippery things in the world of medicine. Her oncologist said the scans looked better in a way that made the nurse clap and the receptionist rearrange appointments with a lightness that was almost illicit. Her blood work read like a long sentence that paused and then, unexpectedly, continued. They called it partial remission and put a small star next to it in their notes, as if stars could be translated into rent money. To me, it was proof that my reckoning with the rules and with Sarah had meaning beyond spectacle. I took my mother to Highgate once, a slow afternoon drive through a town that still smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. She sat in the visitor chair in Sarah's new room while the sun angled through the glass and painted the linoleum. She watched Sarah's hands move and then looked at me with an expression that was at once bewilderment and gratitude. "Is she—" my mother asked, and I could see the shape of the word in her mouth, that she looked different, that she seemed to be alive in a way my mother had not expected to see. "I think she is getting more to choose, Mom," I said. "We give things to each other. The rules help us keep those things safe." Mom smiled. She reached out and gently touched the plant on the windowsill. She didn't touch Sarah because the rules had taught her to respect that boundary, but her hand hovered in a way that was itself a form of communion. "Thank you," she said later in the car when we stopped at a diner to split a pie, "for staying." I didn't know how to answer. I thought of the laminated card in my wallet and the way its edges had softened. I thought of the nights when I had been tempted to throw it away, and of the way the same set of rules had, in their odd and bureaucratic way, taught me to hold my attention steady for other people. There were times when I resented the weight of it, when a patient cried at 3 in the morning and no answer came because the nurse's station had 3 alarms firing at once. The rules felt like a bandage that couldn't fix bone. Some staff grumbled. There were moments when the laboratory model Dr. Peller had described as threads and tuning forks felt like a convenient metaphor to paper over things that were more like relationships than data points. But even Dr. Peller would admit, with his usual caution, that what we had was messy and human and worth protecting. Sarah learned, in her odd, patient way, to ask more. She learned to ask permission rather than take it. She would lean toward the glass and breathe letters into the fog. A question, a small permission. She painted with watercolors on newsprint, soft blues and stark blacks that always included fine loops like those she drew in the neutral room. Those sketches hung in my locker like talismans. When I had a bad night, when anonymous texts came and my hands shook, I would take them out and look. They reminded me that she was a person and not a phenomenon. What we never solved was whether the bridging was an ability that connected in one direction or many. Sometimes it felt like a warmth you rubbed across your palms. Other times it was a pressure like being in a crowded elevator. We never stopped asking questions, and we never lied about the cost. Sarah would come out of a long session and need to lie down and would say in that small voice, "It takes the edges from me." We offered her therapy, music, sunlight, and time. We tried to repay what she'd been asked to carry. There were wins that mattered. Emma moved out of the wing and began attending an arts group in town that a volunteer ran. Mrs. Bergeron began to recall a neighbour's name after years of forgetting. Mr. Leopold came by now, and then with a thermos and a half-smile, and would sit by the window and watch the way Sarah and my mother would talk without words and make little trades of kindness. Doctor. Bella published a modest paper that became a touchstone at conferences. It was hedged with caveats and phraseology like "in this setting and under controlled conditions," which made the academic world nod politely. And there were losses, not violent, not cinematic, but the slow attrition of human lives that happen in hospitals. A man in the West Wing I had swept floors near passed on a snowy night. His bed sat empty under a blanket, and staff whispered about his family and the gaps they left. We honored him, we did what we could. One night, months into the program, I was alone in the corridor carrying a bucket that smelled like lemon and old linens when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. For a second, I felt the old flash of dread. The message, however, was short and odd. "Thank you for keeping your hands to the mop." There was a small, private laugh that escaped me and then broke into something like a sob. The texts had been a menace for so long that a gratitude felt almost subversive. I pocketed the phone like you pocket a small miracle. People ask me now how I lived with the knowledge of what I had seen. They imagine nights rigid with fear that I never slept. Truth is, I slept in fits. I dreamed in threads sometimes, places where someone else's memory wandered into mine like a stray dog. But I also learned a new kind of patience. I learned to set my mind down like a loaded dish and to pick it up when the table was steady. I learned that rules, contrary to my first instinct, can be the architecture of care when applied with humility. There were boundary questions we had to police. Dr. Paler spoke at a staff meeting about consent and about what to do if somebody came to you outside the neutral room asking for contact. He made it clear his hypothesis was that proximity, eye contact, and certain environments acted like amplifiers. He asked staff not to treat the phenomenon as entertainment. "We are stewards, not experimenters," he said, and the phrase stuck like a good label. Once, a family member of a patient, driven by worry, came down and demanded to know if Sarah could reach someone who had gone missing in memory. The man, eyes raw, voice thick, wanted answers, wanted mercy. Duchesne met him with a dozen rules and a kind of human respect that did not make him gentle. In the end, the family member left with a pamphlet about community resources and a promise of a phone call. Ethical clarity is messy in practice. We tried not to lie. My mother had a small relapse. It terrified me. The doctors called it a setback, the kind that made you feel like someone had given you a book with missing pages. I sat at her bedside and felt the rules of my life contract in on themselves. The nightly shift, the training sessions, the painting of windows. All of it took on a new sheen of urgency. Mom, for her part, was indomitable in the quiet way people become when terrified of being a burden. She preferred to call those nights recharging. She joked sometimes about the fact that I kept a laminated card in my wallet like a priest keeps rosary beads. When her oncologist called me 3 months after the relapse and said, in a voice that softened despite the professional distance, "Things are looking better," I cried in the middle of the hospital parking lot and felt myself embarrassed at the size of that relief. It wasn't a miracle. The doctor didn't say miracle. He said better. To my ears, it was a small, enormous thing. The last board meeting that matters for this part of my life took place in a conference room with a long table and coffee that tasted like the kind of thing people drink when they know their job matters. There were slides, charts showing patient stability, testimonials from staff, and Dr. Peeler's cautious rhetoric. Emma was present in the audience, looking a little less fragile than she had a year before, and she tapped her fingers on the folder in a way that seemed in conversation with the hope we were offering. They approved more funding for anchor training and for mental health support for staff. They recommended a broader study. They gave Sarah a permanent room that had proper sunlight and a small garden outside. It felt like an institutional nod of contrition and of possibility. I felt tears behind my eyes that day and did not try to hide them. People ask me if I'm still a janitor. I still mop floors, yes. I still push a cart that squeaks. I still check the vending machines and learn which ones jam when I forget to press them right. But my job title has grown unofficially. I am a night janitor and an anchor. I am in some ways a translator between a world that is loud in a language I never thought I would learn and people who had been silent for decades. There are days when the weight of it presses, when the texts come and the old fear rises. But there are also mornings when Sarah sits by the window, her face lit by a sun that looks like the promise of something simpler, and I stand nearby with a washcloth and a small pot of tea, and we trade small, safe glances. We have a handshake now. Nothing physical that would violate the rules, but something like it. She'll press her fingers slightly against the glass, and I will tap twice on my chest. It means, I see you, I'm here. We stop when you say stop. On my days off, I sometimes drive out of town a little ways, down a road that arcs between pines, and I think about Mr. Leopold and the evening he sat with me and told me to be stubborn in the right ways. I think about Mrs. Bergeron and the way she taught me to resist the urge to be a fixer of souls, to be a keeper instead. I think about Emma, whose laughter I still hear in the recreation room when she is teaching a newer patient how to fold paper cranes. There are nights when I think about the coffin-like silence of the basement and the first time Sarah wrote on the glass. Even now, months and years later, that memory is crisp. It is not only a scene of terror, it is a hinge. It is the moment a life changed direction, because I chose to keep my job and to let a set of rules shape how I would be part of something fragile. Sometimes people tell me they admire me for staying. I always offer a more complicated answer. I tell them about my mother and the money and the pull of the job and the guilt that comes with walking away from something you accidentally touch. I tell them about the rules, Rule 1 through Rule 7, each a line that reads like a warning and a promise. They are ugly in paper form and beautiful in practice. On a slow afternoon, after a session, Sarah drew a small loop on a scrap of paper and slid it into my hand. It was one of her thread drawings, precise and contained. I looked at it and then looked at her. She mouthed something that I couldn't quite read, and then she reached toward the glass and tapped it 3 times, her signal that she wanted me to know. "Thank you," she said in my head, and it was not only a line. It landed like sunlight on a damp mattress. For once, the anonymity of the texts and the bureaucracy and the fear all seemed to reconcile into a strange, human gratitude. It didn't fix everything. It was a small altar. The sun falls differently in Vermont now as the seasons turn. The hospital's bricks are older, but no less resolute. Sometimes snow will settle on the rotunda and make the building look like a thing wrapped to keep it warm. I drive home after my shift with the radio set to something quiet and with my hands smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and smoke from that night when we lost and then found more than we'd expected. At the kitchen table, my mother will be reading a book, small print, a mug that never seems to cool, and she'll look up and say, "How was your night?" The question is ordinary and excruciating and lovely. I tell her about the small things, a patient who learned to bake again, a nurse who found her footing, a window that stole the sky for someone who had been kept away from it for 70 years. She often touches the laminated card when I set it on the table, not reading the words so much as feeling the edges. "You did the right thing," she said once, and I believed her not because she said it, but because I could see it in the lines around her eyes, the relaxation of someone who'd felt the world tilt and then return. I'm not naive. New problems will come. There will be more anonymous texts and the occasional careless hand. There will be debates about funding and ethics and what the word study covers and what it hides. There will be nights when the hum of the fluorescent sounds louder than the city. There will be staff who tire and leave, and staff who come in with good intentions and not enough training. The world is a complicated place, and the Highgate rules are a small, crafted response, not a cure. But there is a kind of stubbornness in me now that I didn't have before. I take the laminated card out sometimes and run my thumb along the edge. Rule 1, never enter the basement after 10 p.m. Rule 2, never make eye contact with patient 001. Rule 3, do not respond to voices not spoken aloud. Rule 4, do not write or leave messages for patient 001. Rule 5, do not touch the observation glass. Rule 6, report any anomaly to the night supervisor immediately. Rule 7, do not discuss patient 001 outside staff. They are more than warnings. They are a way we choose to be careful with one another. They are a frame for consent. They are a manual for what to do when connection threatens to become domination. They are not perfect. They are not poetic. They are necessary. On the day I finally felt like I could say I had a purpose beyond the pay, Sarah tapped twice on the glass and drew a single long thread that ended in a small sun. I pressed my palm to the other side and matched the pressure. Not touching the glass, not breaking Rule 5, but making contact in the only way the rules allowed. It was a small exchange, but the whole of it felt huge. A person asking for light, another person answering with a presence. I kept my hand there for a long minute and then let it fall. Outside, the morning had pulled itself out of night, and my windshield held the last of the frost. I thought about the way the rules had started as a list of forbiddances and turned, slowly and imperfectly, into an architecture of care. If this whole story surprised you, if it made you feel like the world is weirder and kinder than you expected, there's more where this came from. If you want to hear about other nights, other small decisions that reshaped what duty meant, subscribe, and I'll tell you the rest. But if you take only one thing away, let it be this. Rules can be ugly and bureaucratic and necessary, and sometimes they are the scaffolding we need to learn how to hold another person's mind without breaking ours.